I have lifelong gender dysphoria from a very young age, and that whole journey, which I'm almost 50 now, so a lot of years of struggling with that and managing it. And I did medically transition 15 years ago. If you talk to a lot of gay and lesbian people who are happy being gay and lesbian, a lot of them will say that they had cross-sex identification and gender nonconforming behavior as children.
Mhm.
So the vast majority of kids, the literature, I think there's about 7 studies now, and they all say the same thing. The numbers are all slightly different, but they all say the same thing, that the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria are the homosexual subtype.
Mhm.
And the vast majority of those, like about 80%, desist by the time they're adults and become happy, healthy gay and lesbian people.
Hmm.
So the concern is, if we're labeling kids trans, either parents or teachers or clinicians saying you are a trans person because you have these feelings, we're consolidating and solidifying their identities as a trans identity. They're far less likely then to desist. And so in essence, it's gay and lesbian conversion therapy to an extreme. It's these, 80% of these kids who would have grown up to be healthy, happy gay and lesbian people, instead of supporting and affirming them, we're actually giving them a trans label and medicalizing them, oftentimes needlessly. And so I don't personally agree with childhood medicalization or social transition for that reason.
Nowadays it's pretty easy to be called a transphobe if you have certain concerns that most likely everybody's thinking, but not saying out loud. In this report, we're going to talk about gender dysphoria and have a special guest to do that with, so stay tuned. Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News. Now, you may have questioned whether or not it's fair for biological males who identify as transgender women to compete against biological women in sports. But that is considered transphobic for some. Or maybe you saw multiple reports on mainstream media about a Ruby Ebby. Take a look at Ruby here. Ruby allegedly sexually assaulted a child in the park and was referred to as a woman in mainstream media. Maybe you scratch your head for a second and thought, wait a second, did any journalists actually look into how long Ruby's been calling Ruby? Because maybe Ruby just wants to go to a women's prison. And then you thought, wait a sec, should biological males who identify as a transgender go to women's prison? That's transphobic. But perhaps the quickest way to be called a transphobe, even when you're not, or even when you're a transgender person yourself, is to say maybe we need to give children with gender dysphoria a bit more time to age before we allow them to, remove body parts or take treatments that might make them sterile for the rest of their life. That's really transphobic. Now, that discussion gets heated fast, I should know, from many of the reports I've done. And today I am bringing you an interview with someone very qualified to speak about gender dysphoria, who also shares some concerns about gender dysphoria today, how it's handled compared to when he had it as a child. Aaron Kimberly is the founder of an organization called Gender Dysphoria Alliance. The organization's primary goal is to depoliticize gender dysphoria by separating the condition of gender dysphoria and its treatments from queer theory, and to advocate for a narrative for gender dysphoria that is based on medical evidence instead. I think you're going to really enjoy this interview, so sit down and take a seat. But before I get right to it, I just want to point out, if you appreciate that you're hearing a report that's even willing to have a speaker on it like this, then please, if you can, support our independent journalism. We don't take a penny from the federal government's media bailout, which means we are free to discuss whatever is of public interest. You can donate to help our journalism continue at realreporters.ca.
I have lifelong gender dysphoria from a very young age, and that whole journey, which I'm almost 50 now, so a lot of years of struggling with that and managing it. And I did medically transition 15 years ago. And we can unpack that a little bit later if you want. But
Yeah.
and then I also a registered nurse with a specialization in mental health. And I had been working for about the same amount of time that I transitioned. So I was in nursing school when I medically transitioned, and knew in nursing school I wanted to specialize in mental health. So I was working in Vancouver for psychiatric inpatient units initially for quite a number of years, and then the provincial eating disorders program in a leadership position. And then I started working. St. Paul's Hospital started a youth program called the Inner City Youth Program, doing outreach to young people on the streets and providing interdisciplinary care. And so that's when I started working with youth. And then that clinic ended up expanding throughout the province, and is now called a Foundry network of clinics. And so I moved to Kelowna to be with my wife and her kids, and started working at the new Foundry Center in Kelowna and helped them open that and launch it. We weren't a gender specialist clinic, but we did have quite a few trans youth coming to us because they were telling us that there really wasn't anywhere else in Kelowna to serve their needs. And so we were seeing them in very high numbers, wanting hormone starts and supports and counseling. And our physicians at our clinic were willing to do that. We're interested in doing that work. They didn't have much experience and knowledge, so we did seek training from the Provincial Health Authority. We had them come to Kelowna a couple of times to do training for us. And because our physicians were only with us part-time, and as a nurse, I was full-time staff there. And because of my personal history, I offered to help coordinate the services to take some of those pieces off of our physicians. Mm-hmm. And I started doing hormone readiness assessments for the physicians. And so where I became concerned was that in the training that we received, so we had, like I said, we had the Provincial Health Authority come out a couple of times to do these 2-day intensive workshops with us. And I was doing the weekly mentorship calls and some other training. And the first time they came out to do the training, it was very much, I would describe it as kind of like cultural sensitivity training. It was like 2 days of using the right pronouns. And if you make a mistake with a pronoun, this is what you do, and making people comfortable. And I thought, well, there are people in our clinic that maybe haven't had any experience working with this population. So maybe for some people that is helpful. So we had them ask them to come back a second time about a year later, because by then we had been doing the clinical work for quite some time. And we wanted to do a deeper dive and really learn how to do the clinical work well. So we had them out again, and they really did the same, like 2-day, cultural sensitivity training, putting up like the genderbread man that they show to like 6-year-olds in elementary school now, explaining this is what trans is. And there was no mention of gender dysphoria as a clinical condition. There was no presentation of what is gender dysphoria, what does the medical literature say about that, what does the research say. They didn't present any evidence-based information. It was all public, like community surveys, and are very much of a queer theory framework, which is a political cultural theory. It's not a clinical discipline. So I started to become concerned, and seeing how much practice has changed over the 15 years since I went through it, because I went through it when it was much more careful and slow, and we still called it gender identity disorder back then. That's what I was diagnosed with. And so I've been out of the loop now for quite some time. So I was surprised at how much all of that has changed. Clinicians were talking about more of an informed consent model, which means that the clinician's role is to do an assessment of your ability to provide informed consent, and that's it. There's not really much emphasis on doing a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and those kinds of things. It's more sign a waiver, provide them with information about risks and benefits, and that's it. So people were receiving hormones after sometimes like a single visit, and that's quite different. Wow. That's a very different way of practicing than what I assumed was happening, and that really started to concern me. So I started to push back a little bit on a clinical listserv that I was on. And this is a community of practice of other clinicians doing this work. And some have been doing it for many, many years. And they were using the very cultural language as well as very queer theory language, and using slurs like TERF to describe certain women, like Abigail Schreier in her book. And so I jumped in with just a different perspective, that ideology is separate from a clinical condition, and that ideology is maybe a way of grappling with the condition and trying to understand it, but it's not the same thing as the condition. And we should be allowed to debate ideology. Queer theory is an academic discipline. We should be able to debate it. It's meant to be an ongoing conversation. It wasn't meant to be clinical formulation or dictating practice. So I just became very concerned by the ideological capture at the level of the clinical system of care.
Right. And so there's a lot to unpack. You weren't kidding there, but
Yeah.
It definitely seems like you have a lot invested in this organization that you brought here. I want to backtrack a little bit to informed consent.
Sure.
And just kind of ask how that compared to what you recall when you started first experiencing gender dysphoria. What was consent like then compared to now?
Well, I started experiencing gender dysphoria as a very young child. Like age 3 is my earliest memory of it, and it was pretty consistent throughout my life. But back then, trans wasn't a word that I knew, that it wasn't really on our radar. I grew up in a small town in the prairies in Canada, a very small farming community, and there wasn't even a gay or lesbian community, let alone a trans community. So it was a confusing experience for me, but and a lot of the kids that I grew up with thought that I was a boy, and when I was a really little kid, I just existed in my town as one of the boys. It wasn't. And then as an adult, I moved to the city. That's when I started to meet gay and lesbian people, and including some very masculine women and some very effeminate men. And so I started to make sense of it for myself as this is something that some same-sex attracted people experience, is this gender nonconformity or cross-sex feelings. And so that's how I made sense of it for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
Which didn't make it go away, but at least I had a framework in which to understand it, and met a lot of other gay and lesbian people who described something similar to what I was describing. And then I did study queer theory back in the early 90s, before it was even called that, studied Judith Butler and some of those theorists. And that had an appeal to me. I was in art school at the time, and my friends and I were making a lot of art based on those theories.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until many years later, actually, until I moved to Vancouver and met other trans people, and there were things going on in my life. It was a particularly vulnerable time in my life. And I saw a documentary on TV about trans kids. And this would have been in the early 2000s, like about 2006, roughly. And the documentary offered a different narrative than the one that I had been learning in the gay and lesbian community. So instead of understanding gender dysphoria as something that some gay and lesbian people feel, the documentary described gender identity disorder, and if you had these cross-sex feelings, that meant you were a trans person as like a separate category of personhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because of the things that were going on in my life, and just the emotional vulnerability that I was experiencing at that time, my life was in a bit of upheaval at that particular moment. And a gay man had been murdered in Vancouver fairly recently at that time, Aaron Webster. And that had been weighing on me. And so when I received this information, and it was on mainstream media, like it was on CBC or something like that, and it had a certain credibility to it. And so when it said, when you feel this way, you are a trans person, it completely flipped my identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of bought that narrative, and that's the point that I went to the one gender clinic in Vancouver and was started on hormones fairly quickly. But at that time, so that was 15 years ago. So there was an assessment process, and lasting a couple of months. So that was an intermediate stage, because those that transitioned a little bit before me I have a friend that saw a psychiatrist for 2 years before he was started on hormones. So it used to be much more careful, a lot more assessment, a lot more exploration of your identity, and really and diagnosis. And so what's changed is the elimination of that carefulness and that scientific inquiry and curiosity and an understanding of this as a clinical condition, because they're saying that it's not a clinical condition of any kind, that it's just natural diversity. And yet there's this rush to medicalize it.
Yeah.
So much of that narrative just doesn't make sense to me when you really, when it's something that we don't have any necessarily personal vested interest in. Maybe a person doesn't think too hard about it and dig a little deeper. It might sound kind of strange to some people, but whatever, like until it impacts you personally, I think most people don't really take the time to really dissect what is that theory, where's that theory coming from. But as a clinician with young people in front of me, it was very clear to me that they were coming to me for lots of different reasons. Though they all were seeking hormones. We had some that were psychotic. We had some that were very traumatized. We had some that were very lonely autistic kids or kids with ADHD. And I had a sense in my stomach that they were looking for a peer group, and one even said, well, I've never experienced gender dysphoria. I just identify as trans. And so I just had a sense that this is no longer about gender dysphoria and the treatment of gender dysphoria. This is a whole cultural and political movement that's taken over. And some of those queer theories that I was learning back in university in the early 90s are now being taught to 6-year-olds in the public school system as just material reality. And that was never the intent of queer theory. Queer theory is a political strategy. It's meant to blur boundaries between things intentionally in order to disrupt. It's based on this idea that categories are something to be feared and dismantled, because if you can categorize a group of people, that is for the purpose of oppressing them. And so from the queer theory perspective, that Foucault believed that that gay was an invention in order to target and oppress gay people. You had to be able to clearly identify and delineate who those people are. And so the queer theory project is all about, well, let's do a little smoke and mirrors show here to blur those boundaries between things like gay and straight or male and female, thinking that would somehow liberate us from oppression. But I think vulnerable young people especially take those theories very, very literally. If you go into a school system and you tell kids that here's your gender spectrum, you got G.I. Joe on one side and Barbie on the other, and plot yourself on that spectrum, right? And so unless you're a G.I. Joe or Barbie, then you must be trans of some kind, right? Or non-binary. And so they're learning queer theory as though this is fact. And that's not what queer theory was intended to be.
Yes. And then, I've done lots of interviews with people who have similar concerns with you about the kids, and also sort of the lack of the role that parents who are concerned maybe about kids taking hormones too soon or things like that have. And they often get called, transphobe for speaking out these things. I wonder how you've been treated for raising your concerns in this area.
I've also been accused of transphobia or internalized transphobia. Even as a trans person myself, I'm fortunately not immune to that kind of attack. And some trans activists in particular have gone after me and threatening my career and trying to get me fired. I wouldn't be surprised if I get reported to the College of Nursing at some point, but which is unfortunate because my intent is to protect these kids. I've been around in the community a long time. I lived, over 30 years of my life as a lesbian, and I studied queer theory in college too, and I think I understand it reasonably well. And I want the kids to be able to benefit from my experience, and so it's frustrating to be told that I can't think critically, or I can't draw from my many years of personal experience to help these kids. And meanwhile, I mean, I have friends who transitioned 20 years ago who now say they regret it. I have one that he's actually detransitioning now, but he really feels, he still goes by male pronouns for now, but he feels his transition had more to do with the sexual trauma he experienced as a child. And it took him many years to kind of work through all of that, but he's now quite upset that he transitioned and everything he's lost as a result. So I'm hearing those stories, right? I'm hearing stories of people who transitioned because of sexual trauma, who transitioned because for political reasons, or, they just thought they loved that queer theory so much that they transitioned for political reasons, or they transitioned, to masculize or feminize their body, but they don't have gender dysphoria. And so I've heard all of those stories over the years of different reasons for why people transition. And I just think there's a lot, when you take off the lid off the box of the whole trans question, there's a lot there that's hiding. And I'm not coming from a hateful place. I just feel like if we're going to do right by these kids, we need to have honest and open conversations about what's actually going on.
And so for parents who might be having a trans child, or a child that feels like they are, can you explain a little bit about the difference between gender dysphoria, which it sounds like you had from a very young age, versus rapid onset gender dysphoria? And then I see you also have some other similar ones that you could explain on your website as well, and maybe just let us know the differences between all those categories.
Sure. I mean, many years ago, when this was much more rare and wasn't as marketed and branded the way it is now, there were two primary types of gender dysphoria in the literature studied at that time, by some of the leading psychologists in this area are Canadians, like Dr. Blanchard, who developed the original two-type typology. So there was a childhood onset gender dysphoria, which some also call the homosexual subtype, because the vast majority of those of us with that type are gay or lesbian. So that was one type. And then the other type is called Autogynophilia, or AGP for short, which Blanchard described as an inversion of a heterosexual orientation, by which someone became attracted to the idea of their own body as female. So those were the two primary types that they were seeing in clinics at that time. And those two types definitely still exist. There are people in the network at the Gender Dysphoria Alliance who have out of both of those types. So I have the homosexual subtype. We do have members that have AGP as well. And there do seem to be new types that have emerged since then. Dr. Blanchard and Dr. Bailey wrote a really great essay for Fourth Wave Now, where they outline some of the newer types and explain kind of what those are and what the age of onset is, and the types of people that tend to fall into those categories. So they do talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria as well, which when Dr. Littman, and Dr. Littman's one of our advisors for our organization, because we really wanted her expertise about ROGD in particular. And I don't believe she intended that to be a diagnostic category, more so a name of a phenomenon. And there's different thoughts about why that phenomenon has happened, but it seems to be similar types of people that are impacted by it, though. Very, very smart, mostly girls, but not exclusively. And there seem to be more and more boys all the time who seem to be captured ideologically, and highly influenced by peer groups. They may also have a diagnosis like autism or ADHD. And there's a concern that it's a little bit like, well, not a little bit, a lot alike the satanic panic that happened a number of years ago here in Canada after the book Sybil was released, and then a movie about multiple personality disorder developing after trauma. There was an explosion of young women
who had
it all of a sudden, and it was later discovered that it was the power of suggestion, that once it was on people's awareness. It was on the media a lot. Clinicians were hypersensitive to looking for it. And they felt that clinicians and the media played a huge role in the development of this kind of like pseudo type of multiple personality disorder that wasn't actually real. And I do believe something like that has happened with gender dysphoria. And I think the same things are contributing to it. The media plus very well-meaning clinicians are hypersensitive to looking for it and quick to kind of suggest that in young clients. And it's created a perfect storm for this explosion of young people all of a sudden saying that not even that they have gender dysphoria, but saying that they're trans, which is very different from my experience, because I don't remember a time when I didn't feel gender dysphoria. I was just a very naturally gender nonconforming person. I identified strongly with other boys. And when I eventually decided to transition, that wasn't a surprise to my parents, because I was just innately masculine as a girl. And that's not something I could have hidden well, I don't think. So that's quite different than a girl that's, very naturally feminine and seems comfortable to be feminine her whole life, but then all of a sudden, wants her hair cut short and wants to appear more male, having shown no signs of gender nonconformity at any other point in their lives.
Now, you mentioned sort of the systems or things that might be working towards the theory of what creates possibly rapid onset gender dysphoria. And you also mentioned maybe that doctors themselves can be part of that happening. When I've tried to cover and report on certain stories, again, mainly parents shocked to find out that their child is scheduled for a mastectomy without their consent, or something like that, or the father, who I'm sure you heard of, who ended up going to prison for speaking out against his journey or battle in trying to have his child not have the hormones before. But even as a journalist, I haven't been able to really get into these doctors, even if they have such a high percentage of trans children that they help transition. It seems like there's laws to kind of keep me from even informing the public about that. I just wonder, as a nurse, what's your perspective of, a doctor, for example, having the vast majority of transitions in an area being approved by themselves, by that specific doctor?
Some of these doctors have become activists themselves, and they're used to, they've been so immersed in that queer theory culture that I think it creates huge blind spots for some of them. And some of them have even, I've heard, adopt trans identities themselves after many, many years of doing the work. And so I am very concerned about that ideological capture, because one of the pillars of medical practice is science and evidence and peer-reviewed evidence and a healthy curiosity, that we're supposed to keep thinking about, these clinical problems through. And I feel like because of the degree of ideological capture I'm seeing, there's a science denial that goes along with that. And I feel like that's strayed too far from what I expect of clinicians. If I went to a clinician now and said, why do I feel like I'm a boy in some way? And they just said, well, because you say so, that wouldn't be a very satisfying answer to me. And so I don't mind that some people transition. I think it can be an appropriate treatment for people that have severe gender dysphoria, but we still need evidence-based information. I feel like as a consumer of this system, I am entitled to evidence-based information. That's what we expect of our clinicians, is that they're on top of the research and they're able to provide us evidence-based information. So I would like to know about what is gender dysphoria and what does the research say. So as a nurse, I dug into the medical literature because I was so confused by what I was hearing from the training and other clinicians, because like I said, they were talking queer theory. They weren't really talking a lot of science. And so I dug into the scientific literature, and that's when I learned about, Dr. Blanchard and Dr. Zucker, and I'd heard their names, but I'd never really dug into their research. So when I read that Dr. Blanchard's typology, it was so helpful for me and illuminating, because I saw myself in that narrative. It helped me to understand, and it confirmed that my original take on this was correct after all, that this is something, for those of us with the homosexual subtype, it's somehow related to our sexual orientation. And so that initial perception I had that this is just something that some gay and lesbian people experience and feel, I think that was correct. And so we're missing that in this narrative. That isn't the narrative that these young people are hearing. And it's not something that their clinicians are telling them either. That if you talk to a lot of gay and lesbian people who are happy being gay and lesbian, a lot of them will say that they had cross-sex identification and gender nonconforming behavior as children. So and the vast majority of kids, the literature, there's about 7 studies now, and they all say the same thing. The numbers are all slightly different, but they all say the same thing, that the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria are the homosexual subtype. And the vast majority of those, like about 80%, desist by the time they're adults and become happy, healthy gay and lesbian people. So the concern is, if we're labeling kids trans, either parents or teachers or clinicians saying you are a trans person because you have these feelings, we're consolidating and solidifying their identities as a trans identity. They're far less likely then to desist. And so in essence, it's gay and lesbian conversion therapy to an extreme. It's these, 80% of these kids who would have grown up to be healthy, happy gay and lesbian people, instead of supporting and affirming them, we're actually giving them a trans label and medicalizing them, oftentimes needlessly. And so I don't personally agree with childhood medicalization or social transition for that reason.
For me, another thing is just the development of your reasoning capabilities. Even your brain itself isn't fully developed in the frontal cortex to really do that. That's why teens aren't voting and driving cars and, drinking and things like that too. Now, you mentioned conversion therapy. What's your organization's take on that? Or just adults who, go to, let's say, their pastor and say, you know what, I don't want to live this way. Can you help me be someone that I want to be?
Yeah, our organization doesn't support conversion therapy as we all commonly understand it. Back when I was a teenager, being gay was still considered a mental illness, and conversion therapy was still practiced. My parents had the option of sending me to a hospital to get convulsive shock therapy for it. So that's how I understand conversion therapy, is this very coercive, abusive therapies that are meant to change your sexual orientation. And those therapies have been proven unsuccessful, even though sexual orientation itself can be fluid. But I don't support any kind of coercive, abusive form of therapy. No ethical therapist out there I would practice that, and it's not condoned by any of our professional bodies. But it's what I oppose is the language of these conversion therapy bills. They're worded in such a way to be so vague and so overreaching that no one really understands what it is that's being outlawed. And so I have a couple of concerns about that. I'm not so much concerned about it in terms of sexual orientation, though I think people should have the right to have the kind of conversations they want to have as adults. Like I have friends who are Christians and same-sex attracted, and they value their faith more than their sexuality. And if they wanted to go and talk to a pastor or a counselor to live a celibate life as a Christian, they should be able to do that. I think that's their right as a Canadian to make that choice for themselves. And I wouldn't call that conversion therapy because it's not coerced. They've asked for that type of therapy. But with gender dysphoria, these bills are worded in a way that's really conflating or gender identity and sexual orientation. Gender dysphoria, well, that those bills don't even mention the word gender dysphoria and the treatment of gender dysphoria. They're worded in such a way that any effort to change your gender identity would be considered conversion therapy. Gender dysphoria, though, is a condition. It is a condition that people seek treatment for. And it can be a very distressing experience to have it. And in my experience, people can recover from it. Even the WPATH standards of care on page 8 says that many people through psychotherapy integrate those cross-sex identification feelings into a healthy identity and no longer feel a need to medicalize or change their bodies. And that has certainly been my experience, that it's not necessarily about changing or eliminating those feelings. It's about integrating them into an identity, like a lesbian identity or a gay identity. And so if a butch lesbian, for example, has gender dysphoria, wants treatment for it, those kinds of therapies would be considered illegal, because they're basically, what they're saying is that conversion therapy would be defined by anything other than affirming somebody's gender identity. So I don't know where that leaves those of us with gender dysphoria to treat it, which is a mental illness.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I could talk to you much longer than this. And I have a feeling you might be back actually on Rebel News. But for those of you just hearing about your organization for the first time, tell us a little bit about what you guys offer there.
Yeah, so we're an advocacy network. So our focus has been on recruitment to just collect people who have the experience of gender dysphoria, because I'm certainly not alone in my concerns about all of this. And so, we've got about 30 members now from all over the world, and we are working on developing our organizational structure. We've got a really solid leadership team and a panel of advisors that include a lot of clinicians and detransitioners, and we've got a few different missions. One is looking at the system of care and the ways that we are concerned that ideology rather than science has taken over the system of care. So that's definitely one of our targets. We also want to rebuild bridges with the gay and lesbian community, and we really want to support people to defend their sex-based rights, including women and gay and lesbian people. Lesbians are being harassed on a regular basis by trans females, saying that they have to sleep with them and that it's transphobic if they don't want to sleep with a trans woman. And so we really want to open up the conversation and talk about ways in which that we can all coexist peacefully and all have rights without infringing on anyone else's rights. And I don't think we need to deny that biology is real in order to achieve that.
Wow. Well, that was complicated. I hadn't heard about the lesbian women and trans war that goes on, I guess, sometimes. Thank you again, Aaron, for being on here.
Thank you.
I look forward to hearing more about what's going on through your organization.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Lots to discuss, lots of questions. So if you want to find more about that organization, you can find it at the written report at Rebel News. And while you're there, don't forget to give us your email and your phone number so we never lose touch. I'm Drea Humphrey, and this is Rebel News.